All right, today we're going to talk about the progressive presidents, which are three presidents in the early 1900s during the progressive era that really pushed progressive reforms and helped the progressive movement move along. The first president we're going to talk about is Theodore Roosevelt, who he was a wealthy person. He was born into a wealthy family. He worked his way up several important positions like police commissioner of New York. He moved out to the Dakotas and ranched, and he fought in the cavalry in the Spanish-American War, which we'll talk about later, and he became governor of New York. And then ultimately, he became vice president, and when William McKinley was assassinated, Theodore Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt had some different views than most presidents had up to this time period. So Roosevelt felt like it was the president's job to look out for the people. It was his job to look out for their best interests and advocate for their needs. And so an example of this, a big thing you're going to need to remember, is the coal miners' strike of 1902. So the coal miners had gone on strike, and at this point, America needed coal to keep houses warm. And so without coal and going into the winter, it was going to be a big deal. So Americans were going to be real cold all winter. So Roosevelt decided that he needed to help end this strike, and so he brought both sides to the White House to sit down with him. You've got the coal mine owners and you've got the laborers, and they sat down to negotiate. And when the owners kind of refused to negotiate, Roosevelt said, all right, well, if you're not going to negotiate, then I'm going to use my troops and I'm going to run the mines for you. And we're just going to run them whether you want us to or not. And I'm going to take control over the mines. And so this caused the owners to sit down to negotiate, and they were able to work out a deal. So Roosevelt kind of used his position, used his power, and forced the sides to negotiate and agree so that America as a whole could have the coal that they needed for the winter. Roosevelt was also suspicious of big business. He didn't really like big business, and so he was a president that used the Sherman Antitrust Act. It hadn't really been used very effectively up until Roosevelt, and so he used it against big businesses. Now, if you remember, the Sherman Antitrust Act is to break up trust, break up monopolies, and so he was against unfair trust, anti-competitive trust, and so he broke up a bunch of important trusts. Okay, so he had kind of the idea that we need to look at different trusts. If it's bad for consumers, we're going to break it up. If it's a monopoly, if it's a trust and it's not hurting consumers, we can leave it alone for right now. But he did break up a lot of trusts. So he's known as a trust buster, and here's a picture of him, fighting a railroad monopoly. So here's the railroad guy, here's TR, and you got Uncle Sam looking on. All right. Teddy Roosevelt, or TR, comes into the presidency in a time period where there's not much government oversight on businesses and advertising and what companies could do and say. And so manufacturers of items could make wild, unsupported claims for medicine to say that they cure things that they don't cure. There was no government agency or group that's checking up and making sure that these products are safe. Food and medicine, no one's checking to make sure that it's not going to hurt anybody. And you've got these companies advertising things that aren't true. And so Roosevelt comes in and he says, I'm going to give Americans a square deal. It's going to be fair, and we're going to try to protect consumers. So the whole idea of his square deal is to protect consumer health and to protect against false advertising. So here are some examples down here you can take a look at. So opium for newborns, using cocaine to help your toothache, stuff that's probably not safe. Okay, it's not safe to give newborns opium in a solution of alcohol. All right, so Roosevelt's going to come in and he's going to create this square deal that's going to look out for the best interests of the Americans, the average Americans. Some of the laws that he passed under his square deal or some things that are going to help consumers, keep people safe. So if you remember Upton Sinclair, he wrote a book called The Jungle about the meatpacking industry, and it really got people's attention because it just outlined how gross it was, how unsanitary it was, all the nasty stuff that's in the meat. And so this led to Congress passing the Meat Inspection Act and passing the Pure Food and Drug Act. So the Meat Inspection Act allowed the government to inspect meat, make sure it's safe, and the Pure Food and Drug Act allowed the government to regulate how food and medicine are prepared and how they're sold to make sure that the average American stays safe. And then he also, Roosevelt, used under his Square Deal legislation, he helped create some legislation, some laws that are going to conserve the nation's resources. So he added a lot of national forests and national parks, and he stopped the sale of public land, people buying public land and using it to develop. So he really preserved a lot of the national parks and national forests that we have today. The next president we're going to talk about is William Howard Taft. So Taft was Roosevelt's guy. Roosevelt endorsed him. Roosevelt said, I'm going to step away. I'm not going to run again, but I want you guys to vote for Taft. Taft is the guy. He's going to continue on my policies. He's going to do a great job. And he was elected. And he continued doing a lot of things that Roosevelt would have wanted him to do, like trust busting. But ultimately, he didn't live up to everything that Roosevelt wanted him to do. He lost kind of the support of the progressives that had supported Teddy Roosevelt because he made some promises that he couldn't keep. He tried to lower the tariff but wasn't able to do it. And then all that land that Teddy Roosevelt had set aside, Taft comes in and he starts selling some of that public land to private individuals who are going to develop it. And so that makes Teddy Roosevelt mad. It makes a lot of the progressives mad. And so he doesn't keep the faith and the support of many progressives. All right, so now we're coming up to a new election. So Teddy Roosevelt won the election in 1904, and then he stepped out and let Taft and supported Taft, and Taft won the election of 1908. They're both Republicans. And then so Taft does things that Roosevelt doesn't agree with. A lot of the progressives don't agree with it. And so Teddy Roosevelt is kind of mad, and he decides, hey, I'm going to come back in. I'm going to run for president again. I'm going to try to fix all these things that Taft messed up. And so we've got both Taft and Roosevelt trying to run under the Republican Party. You can only have one Republican, and through the process, the primary process, you have Taft emerge as the Republican candidate, beating out Roosevelt. So Roosevelt says, all right, well, that's fine. I'm going to create my own party, the Bull Moose Party, or the Progressive Party. And then the third candidate in this race in 1912 is Woodrow Wilson, and he's going to be the Democratic candidate. And now, one thing we know about third parties, and in this case, Teddy Roosevelt is the third party, is that they're going to suck votes from one of the major parties. And since Roosevelt and Taft are both very similar, they both have Republican ideals, Roosevelt is going to suck votes from Taft. So what happens is Woodrow Wilson wins the election, okay, because the votes are split between these two basically Republican candidates. Here's the electoral map for that election of 1912. You can see Taft did not do very well. He came in third, winning only Utah and Vermont. You have Roosevelt winning lots of states, or a decent amount of states for a third party, but because he had sucked so many votes away from Taft, you have Wilson just running away with the election. And look at all the green, totally dominated the election. As far as the Electoral College goes, winning 82% of the electoral vote. So Wilson won the election of 1912, Woodrow Wilson. He comes in and he's going to promise Americans something called a new freedom. So that's similar to what other presidents have done in the past. They like to nickname their legislation that they're going to try to pass. Just like Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal, Wilson has his new freedom. So he's going to tame big business. He's going to bust up trust just like the other two. He's going to encourage greater competition. He's going to lower tariffs. The Underwood tariff lowered tariffs by 25%. He created a graduated income tax. So first time that you have an income tax. Now, income tax was not allowed under the original Constitution, and so they had to make an amendment. And so we have a new amendment, the 16th Amendment, which allows Congress the power to tax people's incomes. And so 1913, they passed an income tax. Graduated income tax, remember that was one of the populist reforms that we talked about in the last unit. Wilson also helps pass the Federal Reserve Act, which gives the federal government more control over the banking system and the national bank and all that kind of stuff, the national money. They control the amount of money the banks can lend, and they break up the country into 12 districts that they each kind of look over a different district. And then antitrust legislation, just like TR, just like Taft, he continues passing laws that restrict unfair business practices using the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies, etc. National parks were also a big deal to Wilson, just like Teddy Roosevelt. So he's a strong believer in protecting natural resources, so he creates the National Park Service and in 1916. And so the National Park Service is going to help conserve natural scenery, wildlife, etc. And so he's doing just like TR did years earlier, and preserving our natural resources that we have here in the United States. And lastly, Woodrow Wilson is going to look out for labor. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire happens 1911, and that's going to be a terrible accident where lots of women are killed in a fire because of unsafe working conditions. And so that's going to lead to a lot of laws that are going to help make things safer. So first he creates the Department of Labor. It's a cabinet position. It's going to help him look for problems, try to fix labor problems, and make sure that things are going well and being safe. He's going to help pass the Clayton Antitrust Act, which basically helps unions. It enables people to unionize. And then the Child Labor Act. This is going to cut down on child labor. Even though the Supreme Court did overturn this, it was a good effort by Woodrow Wilson to restrict child labor.